This is Area 7, and did you know? I wanted to remind you, in case you had lost your bearings along the way a little bit, that in these Did You Know areas, I'm trying to provide you just a little bit of additional insight and thought about one of the topics or some of the folks that we've been reading about this week. And for this week, I guess in particular, our focus has been on, well, I guess I wanted to focus primarily on two of the missionaries that were mentioned in your reading, the missionary Robert Moffat and David Livingstone. You may have picked up from your reading that the two were related, that Moffat was actually the father-in-law of David Livingstone. Livingstone married his daughter when he came to South Africa in the 1840s. Robert Moffat actually went to Africa about 1816 with the London Missionary Society and spent a long time. If you read over 50 years that he spent in Africa, went back to England once during that time period, so very devoted to his time in Africa. And it's interesting when we think about Livingstone by today's standards. Livingstone was apparently a terrible husband and father. If you've read, you see that he wanders off for long periods of time and leaves his wife and his children behind, living in some village somewhere, not knowing if he's dead or alive for years at a time. And finally, he comes to his senses enough where he sends them back to England or to Scotland, where they live a very difficult existence while he traipses about Africa, making explorations and making a great name for himself. Needless to say, there were lots of challenges for married couples on the mission field in the 19th century. Things were not what they are now. Moffat and Livingstone also show us just how diverse the task of the missionary was during this time period. There are a few missionaries who precede them to Africa, so they are not the very first, but they were still doing pioneering work. They were working with peoples and communities who had no prior exposure to the gospel. There was significant language barrier that had to be tackled. And even when a translator was available, say somebody had picked up a little bit of English from a, a pirate who had landed on the coast 20 years ago, I mean, how reliable are they going to be when you are relying on them to help communicate the message of Jesus? And so language was certainly a challenge. These languages were usually not written languages, and so even when missionaries did learn the language, when they tried to do Bible translations, oftentimes they were left essentially helping to create the language itself in order to do the work that they needed to do. Well, you think about settlements had to be built, relationships had to be established. We're trying to learn local dialects. You've got challenges of adaptation, challenges of geography, disease, food, water, homesickness, and we can begin to see that the missionaries from this time period certainly faced a very daunting task when they were on the mission field, which I think speaks to the commitment that they had to the call of God on their life. Well, Moffat apparently worked very diligently at his task, even though if you noticed the portrait that they had of him in the book was sort of this old man, scraggly beard sort of thing going on. By most accounts that we have, both his own, but also from others who knew him and worked with him, Moffat was extremely devoted to the task at hand. He chose not to live in the relative comfort of a larger missionary community, but instead opted to go out and live in the bush. Trying to remember now, I don't have it in my notes here, the name of his community that he lived in, Saruman or something along those lines. was the little community that he helped to develop. It's interesting that he used his skill as a gardener. He was actually trained as a gardener and uses those skills when he arrives in Africa to help sustain the work that he's doing. He used diplomatic skills that he picked up along the way to broker peace, sometimes between surrounding tribes. But his work was difficult, even though he's there for a number of years. It's a long time before he begins to see fruit from the work that he does through conversions. And according to Tucker, you may have picked this up in your reading, part of the reason that it was such a challenge was because of the language difficulty. And Moffat, for a number of years, apparently tried to make do with translators or expecting them to learn English or some sort of common dialect. You had the local individual tribal languages, and then you had like a Dutch blend of Afrikaners that some were beginning to speak during this time period, and so language was all a jumbled mess. And Moffat was trying to use some of those things, and it's only after he takes almost a year to go off and study the language with native speakers himself and begins to appropriate the language that the success begins to come. So, more than 50 years in Africa, Moffat left an impressive legacy of churches, of indigenous or native pastors. He translated the Bible. Lots of the work that you would expect he was engaged in, and even late in life when he does decide to return to England, he's a major statesman for the missionary movement in Africa. And certainly one of the people that he influenced was David Livingstone, although Livingstone opts for probably a little bit of a different approach to missions, if we wanted to call it that. And I think it's probably safe to say that Livingstone is more of an explorer than he is an evangelist. He wrote voluminously back to England and to Scotland about the things that he was doing and experiencing. So his letters, news of his exploits, encouraged a new generation of missionaries, but they were also exciting news of the day about this guy who was traipsing around Africa. And so because of that, he becomes essentially a national hero because of the work that he does in Africa. He's exploring a lot of it for the first time. He's navigating on rivers and into territories that nobody knew about previously. He's really going into the heart of Africa for the first time, going from the Indian Ocean on one side all the way over to the west coast of Africa as well. Lots of connections that he's making, lots of tribal leaders that he's mentioning, discoveries in science and geography that are significant. His missionary influence is probably not as great, however. Now, he certainly uses a lot of religious language. He sees his work as being under the auspices of God. He preaches whenever he has an opportunity. He is trying to promote the Christian faith in every possible way, but because he was not one who put down roots, any seeds that were planted were often left unwatered because Livingstone was off somewhere else. And as I mentioned earlier about his family, sort of similar to William Carey's situation, things were difficult for Livingstone's family. And it speaks of his determination and devotion, certainly to the call and the excitement of what he was experiencing. But his family certainly suffers. Without a doubt, Livingstone loved Africa. That's displayed through his choice as he's old and sort of rediscovered. He's living off in this very remote village when this English reporter comes and finds him and has conversations and begins to write stories about this old man who's come from Scotland and is living in the African jungle. That late in his life, Livingstone decides when he dies, he wants his heart buried in Africa. His body can go back to England, and as you see, he gets quite the burial. in that process, but his heart gets to stay in Africa, and that's the way that he wanted it. So he's a very fascinating figure, but certainly a sort of a controversial figure, and maybe not the ideal missionary in lots of ways.